All right, we figured it out. Who's going to be talking? Figuring it out. Okay.
Okay, so our presentation is Weimar Republic, Germany. And introduction is the Weimar Republic was a German government founded in 1918 and worked 1919 to 1933, the period after World War I until the rise of Nazi Germany. The term Weimar Republic refers to the city of Weimar, where the Republic's Constituent Assembly first took place. Herbert was leader of the Social Democratic movement in Germany and a moderate socialist. He was the leader of the Republic, which attempted to unite Germany after its defeat in World War I. So there was a hyperinflation crisis, which affected the currency at that time, the paper mark, and the prices ran out of control a lot. So at the beginning of 1922, the $1 US dollar would be 400 marks, and then it would change until all those zeros. And yeah, basically there was hyperinflation.
Okay, so obviously there's people that's kind of benefited from it and also suffered from this hyperinflation. And so some that kind of benefited from this are borrowers and landowners, as those that had mortgages are able to pay back their loans easily. Wages can also negotiate their wages every day to keep up with the hyperinflation. And since products of agricultural products remain in demand, farmers can also benefit on this slightly. And sorry, next slide. Thanks. And the people that suffer from it are like those with fixed income, such as because their income does not increase with the hyperinflation, so the value that they earn is grows less and less as time goes on. Students, prisoners, or sick also suffers from this. People with savings as well, which is the opposite of people with borrowing, will be impacted badly as their money becomes worthless and they have to pay more. Daily life also becomes much more difficult for many because the country can't import the goods, and it's a lot harder to survive with the increased difficulties of purchasing goods and services.
So, the cause of hyperinflation. As part of the Treaty of the Versailles, Germany had to pay reparations, so like monetary compensations, to the other countries. Germany struggled to pay huge sums of money because they were already suffering from high levels of inflation due to World War I. France and Belgium sent their troops into Germany's main industrial area, and their aim was to confiscate those industrial goods as reparation payments. However, the German government ordered their workers to follow a policy called passive resistance. So the workers were told to refuse to work or cooperate with the foreign troops, and in return the government would continue to pay their wages. However, because Germany already had high levels of inflation and little sum of money in their accounts, the government wasn't able to pay the wages to the striking workers. So there was already passive resistance, but then the workers started striking because they were not paid their wages. This caused fewer goods to be produced, and this added to the political instability. The stopped production weakened the economy even further. And in order to pay their wages to the striking workers, the government decided to just print more money. This flood of money led to hyperinflation, as the more money was printed, the more prices rose.
Okay, so possible policy to fix this situation. The first one is increase interest rate. It will help reduce growth of AD in the economics. The slower growth will then lead to a lower inflation. Higher interest rates reduce consumer spending because increased interest rate will increase the cost of borrowing, which is discourage consumers from borrowing and spending. Increased interest rates make it more attractive to save money. Increased interest rate also reduce the disposable income for those who with mortgage. Higher interest rate increase the value of exchange rate, leading to a lower export and more import. The second possible policy is supply-side policy, which is aimed to increase the long-term competitive and productivity. For example, it was hoped that privatization would make firms more productivity and competitivity. Therefore, in the long run, supply-side policy can help reduce inflation pressure. However, supply-side policy work very much in the long run. They cannot be used to reduce sudden increase in the inflation rate. Also, there is no ensure government supply-side policy will be reduce the inflation. This other demand-side policy, which is similar to an effect on the monetary policy. Physical policies involve the government changing tax and spending level in order to influence the level of AD. To decrease the inflationary pressure, the government can increase the tax and reduce government spending, which will reduce AD. And last one is changing the currency. In the November of 1923, a new currency was introduced in Germany. It's called Rentenmark. That currency quickly ended this crisis and stabilized price.
That's pretty much it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, team. Now, hopefully you're starting to see connections between all of these case studies that we're looking at. Hopefully you're seeing the policies that we are describing, we are analyzing in a real life situation, and understanding that maybe reality doesn't lead to the efficient market outcome that we expect it to, right? As you saw there, you can see that the Weimar Republic was the big case study in economics. It was what we taught for many a year, right? Before Zimbabwe, it was the thing to discuss in economics. And the history students in the room will be very familiar with World War I and the impact that World War I had. Germany was split and separated. They're trying to bring it back together. Its economy was in ruins. The people were in poverty, right? Unemployment was through the roof. They'd lost all of the people in the war. And the government was just trying to get it back on its feet. It was demanded that Germany repay the Allies a huge amount of money, like so big that Germany was probably not going to be able to ever repay it. It was a ridiculously large amount of money. And so they were desperately, cranking the printing presses to pay that amount. And as you heard, the Allies got a bit upset with the fact that they weren't doing it fast enough. They weren't giving them enough money. So the Allies then went into Germany and went to the biggest industrial part of Germany and took over essentially it and said, all of this output that you're producing, it's ours now. Right? We want all the money from this, which further decreased, as you heard, Germany's output. Well, that can't last. And students of history will understand that you had the war, you had the defeat in the war, you had the humiliating reparation payments, then you had an inept government attempting to solve that problem. You had levels of corruption potentially occurring. Then you had this massive level of unemployment and hyperinflation all occurring within the state of a few years. And then along came a tiny little Austrian man with a little wee moustache who liked to high-five everybody, right? He came along and said, I've got the solution to this, I've got the solution to that, I've got the solution to this, listen to me. And it's not a big surprise. People started listening to him and started saying, oh, we don't like these French people, we don't like these Belgian people, they're trying to destroy our economy, right? People listened to him. He promised them getting out of the debt. He promised that they would become a successful country once again. And so they listened. So economic policy having a direct impact on people's lives, but also there's a relationship between the economic policy, the effect on people's lives, and then the historical events that occurred after it. Right? World War II, all of the deaths, all of the misery that caused, right? There's a relationship between that and the economic policy that was going on at the time in Germany. So understanding that the policies that we put in place can have some quite interesting future effects. All right, now, and you can also see, as said, the similarities between the governments and the decisions that were being made in the Weimar Republic to those that were being made in the Zimbabwean Republic, Zimbabwean economy, and then, of course, also in Venezuela. Now, Japan is a whole different kettle of fish. All right. In fact, if you go to Japan, they spend a lot of money on fish. So Heian, Joel, Nisa, and Seon, let's see what you have to say about Japan.
Okay, I'll present. Can you see it?
Yes, indeed.
Right, so we're Hein, Joel, Nisa, and Suyeon, and we're going to present about deflation in Japan.
The level of deflation in Japan. Japan has been struggling with deflation for more than 2 decades. Japan has deflation in 2017. Inflation rate of 2017 is minus 0.12%. Japan has been trying to get out from deflation, but its inflation rate has been fluctuating, as the graph shows. CPI of Japan is also fluctuating. It can lead to a negative cycle of low corporate investment and sluggish wages.
So first I'm going to introduce the impact on stakeholders. So I'll be talking about the producers or firms in Japan's economy. The biggest impact was the liquidity trap, which means there was a low interest rate, but people were saving more. So investors wait and save before they spend, leading to less investment for a firm because they would predict that the prices would be even lower, and therefore they would wait and spend until it's that point. On the other hand, consumers are also saving money because of the liquidity trap, and they're spending less, therefore reducing the revenue that the firms get. Because of this decrease in revenue, it's a problem because they now have problems and difficulties to cover costs. And this can lead to unemployment as well, as it's included in the cost and they are unable to pay for wages or salaries. I'll cover more of the unemployment later in the consumer section. In addition, we have the credit crunch due to the liquidity trap. So banks are less willing to lend money, and it's more difficult for these firms to take out loans and support their business. Like I said, because they're having difficulty to actually cover their costs and they're unable to actually borrow money, many firms struggle to pay back, and a lot of these businesses actually close down. And I put on the bottom that consumers are not spending, therefore aggregate demand has decreased, leading to excess supply. And in order to sell their excess supply, firms would have to reduce prices in order to sell their goods or services. Next slide. As for the consumers, like I said, the liquidity trap, they expect prices of goods and services to be cheaper. Therefore, they save money and hoard cash. And obviously, this affects the firms as they would probably not actually buy as soon as they have cash, and they'll just wait until the prices get even lower. And again, credit crunch, a lot of consumers are unable to borrow money and actually spend it. And because they're saving it, they're not actually spending it immediately and probably never even spending it in the first place. And then the increase in unemployment, some of the consumers would be laid off due to inability of the firms to pay for wages or salaries. Therefore, this again even like further decreases the spending because they have less income. Next slide. Lastly, the impact on the government was a lot because since, like I mentioned, that the liquidity trap is when you have high interest rate and low interest rates and high saving rates. So monetary policies such as lowering interest rates actually have little to no effect and is essentially ineffective and will not help the situation at all. And in terms of fiscal policy, the government spending was mostly allocated to public work projects or to failing businesses, and this did not help because the money was not dealt with directly with the consumer. Furthermore, they had an economic stimulus attempted by the government, and this has further increased their government debt, and Japan is notorious for having one of the largest, if not most, debt in the world because of their budget deficit. And again, the banking crisis, banks are unwilling to lend, so this has caused difficulties for the government to actually reinflate the economy to help to stop the deflation.
Okay, so why has all this happened in the first place? So in the 1980s, the interest rates were low in Japan, and the level of investment and property valuation went really high. This means like the land and houses were so expensive, and they were getting expensive like every day. And the Bank of Japan realized, oh, this is a bubble, and they raised the interest rate to stop this, like the prices going up, like prices of houses and land. And as a consequence, many debtors who borrowed money from bank, they couldn't pay back the money. And that led to banking crisis, as Nisa said earlier. And the property and stock market, they couldn't return to the levels they were before the boom. And after this, many Japanese citizens, they were just like, okay, I'm just gonna save more money because I just want to be safe. Also, if you know about Japan, Japan is seeing some like really serious aging population problem as well. So that may have contributed too, because in general, elderly people tend to be like conservative and they don't spend as much. And this led to unemployment and reduced aggregate demand because people are not spending. There's no need to like produce a lot, and some workers are not needed. They're unemployed. And so, which means there's excessive supply because people are not consuming, and which led to like decreasing price levels, but also decreasing income levels because people are unemployed. And that was the reason to save even more money. And that deflationary spiral just like goes on forever. And this is generally the reason why deflation is feared more than inflation, because once you get stuck in deflation, it just like keeps going. And yeah, it's really difficult to get out of deflation.
Okay, so what are some possible policies that the Japanese government could use to solve the issue of deflation in Japan? So firstly, the first thing that they could do is they could essentially cut interest rates. Now, this in theory should boost spending, and therefore aggregate demand would increase. And so this is seen here. So as you can see, the price level increases from P1 to P2, and aggregate demand goes from 80 to 82. So there is an increase in aggregate demand and the price level, which will counteract the effect of deflation. Now, this, however, may not always work. You know, for instance, some people would prefer to save because of the ongoing recession. Secondly, people may use this as an opportunity to pay off their debts instead of like spending. And sometimes banks do not want to lend because the interest rates are too low, so they don't feel like lending it to people. So the next slide, sorry. Yeah. So the next solution is unconventional monetary policy. So the first thing that the government of Japan could do is essentially print more money. So in theory, this should create inflation, and basically how this is according to the quantity theory of money that states that the more money there is in the economy, the higher the price level. And so as we can see, and this is illustrated here in this graph here, you can see that as money increases, so M2, as money increases, which is M2, the price level increases from P3 to P2. So there is an increase in price level as money increases. So the second thing that could happen is the second thing that the government could do is they could change inflation expectations. So essentially, when people expect deflation, firms will not give wage rises, consumers won't pay higher prices, But if people expect inflation, then firms are more willing to increase wages, and consumers are more willing to pay now and spend money now instead of saving for future. And so then the third thing that the government could do is use expansionary fiscal policy. So essentially, a cut in taxes will enable them to have enable consumers to have higher disposable incomes, and this should increase consumer spending, and therefore aggregate demand increases. And this is seen again here in this graph, 81 to 82, and price level goes from P1 to P2. Now, increased government investment in public schemes would also have a similar effect. So just general public schemes, and that will also cause an increase in spending and aggregate demand. And thirdly, there's the positive multiplier effect. So this is essentially the idea that whatever money that the government spends in the economy, the final rise in GDP will be higher than the initial investment. So then there are also some supply side effects and other benefits. For instance, lower income tax may increase the incentive for individuals to work, and therefore maybe Japanese citizens may work more. And even though they already are working, they already are like one of the most highly worked people in the world. Higher government spending on education and training. So this could also lead to long-term labor productivity, and this would help in the long-term economic growth of Japan. However, there can also be problems. For instance, government spending could have been inefficient and it could be wasteful. In that case, then it really wouldn't have much of an effect. And there are also some ways by which expansionary fiscal policy may not work. For instance, lower income tax if there is an economic downturn, sometimes there isn't really room for the government to borrow money because they have already exceeded, many of their debt limits. So that can also be another issue. Yeah. And I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Well done, team. Very good. Well done. All right. So yeah, I really liked your presentations, teams. Now, Japan is, as you saw, very different, right? Because they've got deflation, they have similar issues. Okay, they've got unemployment potentially. They've got reduced spending, which is going to push that unemployment number up. But their problem is that it becomes a spiral. And as was very aptly pointed out, sometimes people actually worry about deflation and a deflationary spiral more than they worry about inflation. So it is entirely possible to get an argument and even an exam question that asks you, is inflation worse than deflation? All right. So all of those effects, etc., the possible policies that you could use, all of that would need to be packaged up into your answer. Right? And case study wise, you've got hyperinflation case studies, but you've also got a deflation case study in Japan. And as you saw, Japan has struggled with deflation for 20 years. Right? That's not a short amount of time. That's an extensive length of time. Now, Japan's also the fourth biggest economy in the world, something along those sort of lines. And in the 1980s, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. Right? They were suggesting that it was going to overtake America, and they were just plotting when it was. Now, you've got to say to yourself, why is it that we are so fascinated with Japan? It's because Japan went from 0 to 100 within the shortest space in recorded history. Shortest time in recorded history. It was kind of like, Japan was like the Usain Bolt of the world, all right, with regards to the 100-meter sprint, okay? Japan, after World War II, was completely and utterly ruined. Their economy was rubble, all right? And they built their economy up, and within 40 years, in fact, less than 40 years, yeah, indeed, the Japanese economic miracle, they became the second largest economy in the world. Now, part of that was the structure of their economy at the time. They decided certain economic systems would be put in place, which were sort of emperor by decree sort of idea, and that helped. They generated a colossal amount of savings, which enabled them to do a colossal amount of investing. A lot of supply-side economics was engaged. But then in the 1980s, you saw, as you saw in the presentation, it all collapsed. It was a bubble. And what a bubble means is that it's unsustainable, right? The asset prices in particular, we talk about asset price bubbles, there's nothing supporting the structure, right? So therefore, only the smallest change in your economy or an external event, pop, the bubble explodes and the impact then goes on the rest of the economy. And that's exactly what happened. There is a really good documentary about the Japanese economy, about the miraculous growth that it had, but also about the spectacular collapse of the Japanese economy. And it shows you case studies of people who had mortgaged their home to invest in the stock market, right? Because it was the 1980s, everything, we were getting all this money. Gosh, I dance like my father, right? That's what was happening. And all of those situations didn't work. And the bubble burst. There was asset prices that really did not have any grounding in reality at all, and it all utterly collapsed again. But the problem then became, how do you stimulate the economy? And as you saw, they talked about the government doing expansionary fiscal policy, and they spent and they spent and they spent and they spent, and then they spent some more, and it couldn't dig them out of the hole that they were in, right? And as you also saw, not only have they been in a deflationary spiral for about 20 years, okay, you've also seen how their population, the demographics of their population is going to really hurt them. Right? Japan is the country with the most number of people beyond retirement age of pretty much any other country in the world. Where are the workers? Okay, that's what Japan is going to face. You're wanting to grow the economy, but you don't have the workers. Yeah? So a lot of that is then now coming out into play. And we're seeing this now, and we're seeing the record levels of debt and the government deficits. And, you've got to ask yourself, why on earth would Japan risk holding the Olympics this year? Well, they kind of have to. They need to spend a huge amount of money and building an Olympic stadium and building other Olympic venues and having a whole lot of people come into the country spending money. That's exactly what they need. Okay, so that's why they're doing it, and they did put it off for a year, but they kind of have to now. Right? So it will be very interesting to see what happens in the next month or so when the Olympics actually happens. So again, it's that idea of, does our economic policy work in those sorts of situations? And we saw that no, a lot of our theories will actually break down. That monetary policy comment that you made, that monetary policy became ineffective. Well, that's our tool, right? Fiscal policy, ineffective. All it's doing, seemingly, is generating debt. So what do you do then? Well, if you're looking at hyperinflation, you saw the examples of hyperinflation, and you saw how they abandoned their currencies. I don't know that Japan's likely to do that necessarily, and I don't know that that would be of benefit, but it's that sort of outside of the box thinking that possibly is needed. And now they're in a pandemic. So what is it that they're going to do? We need your minds, right, thinking now, not on this is what the textbook says, but on now we have a new normal. Now we have situations in the world that have never been seen before. Right? We haven't had this. Right? We've had all of these economic situations going on, and now we've got a pandemic thrown on top of it. Okay. Now we're also worrying about America and whether America is going to have inflation or not. We're worried about the level of infrastructure spending and all of those sorts of things, healthcare spending all around the world. We need you out there helping the politicians decide where best to put their money, what the best outcome is for their particular decisions, right? What policies will actually work in the now real. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presentations and your work on those presentations. Now, we are rapidly running close to the end of the year, the end of the academic year. You are running out of year 12, running desperately quick into year 13. And, things to pay attention to, I tell you, understand that you have 2 terms in year 13, that's it. Right? You don't have a third term, right? And part of your term 2 is actually sitting the exams, essentially, all right? So your mock exams are going to be in January. It will be full noise with EEs. It will be full noise with finishing off IAs. It will be full noise with TOKs and everything else, and the joyous CAS interviews, right? So that's all coming. So do have some break over the summer, rest, reflect, touch base with your family. I guess you're kind of doing enough of that already. Touch base with each other, keep in touch. Yeah, keep in touch with each other. Set up like little Google Meets and do like little chats with each other, you know, like my son does, right, with his friends. And just keep in touch. Do, what is it you do? You do shared movie viewings or whatever it is, and you all sit there watching the same movie so you can, as if you're in the same room talking to each other. There will be opportunity, I'm sure, when the numbers will go down and the government will open it up. Yeah, okay, that's sort of an idea. That's a good idea, Fatima, right? The numbers hopefully will go down, that hopefully less than 4,000. They're now opening 24-hour vaccinations, and they're opening the big sports stadium to do 24 hours, 7 days a week from now, apparently. And they're opening the big sports stadium to do thousands upon thousands of vaccinations at a time. And yes, you can make an argument that maybe they could have done that before, but okay. And there are going to be lots of ifs, buts, and maybes, okay? And we need to understand that. We've got staff members who have actually going overseas for their summer break, okay? Well, they need to sort out visas and coming back in and, you know, flights and all of those sorts of things. So there might actually be quarantined teachers attempting to teach you in the new academic year. We don't know. We don't know. So there will be lots of if, buts, and maybes. It might be that we're back in school, but it's only the exam classes and not the rest. Okay. It might be that we're all back. You know, we really don't know. So just treasure your summer, do some revision, absolutely, do some work on EEs and IAs and all the other bits and bobs that you need, but do have a bit of a break, all right? Now, Friday is a bit different for you all because you've got, I believe, an extended tutor time, and then you have a assembly, an end-of-year assembly, which is, according to the calendar, that's going to take lesson 1 out. So I will see you, but I will be seeing you on Friday in lesson 2, not in lesson 1. All right, so I've got a plan for that. I've got a wee quiz, which I think would be kind of fun for you to do. It's economics and general knowledge, which amounts to superheroes and basketball. So, you know, Joel and I will do all right. Yes. All right, team. So otherwise, have a break today. You know, start thinking about your summer. Start actually writing your to-do lists and getting all of that all set up. Right? If you have any questions about IAC2, you can always send me emails between now and tomorrow. Otherwise, as we'd say in the land of my birth, hey Kornera, thank you again for the work that you've done today, for your presentations.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. See you.
Mr. David.